There comes a moment in a man's life when he must ask himself whether he is truly thinking with a clear mind or whether his thoughts are being hijacked by invisible impulses. Not because he is weak, but because he has never been taught to master the raw power that pulses within him. This power, what many call life force, drive, essence, is not something to be discarded without consequence. It is the sacred fuel of masculinity. When a man chooses to retain it, not merely as a form of control, but as a way of honoring his own energy, his mind begins to change in ways he never imagined. The first and most obvious transformation is clarity, not the surface level clarity that comes from a good night's sleep or a strong cup of coffee, but a deeper, more piercing awareness. Thoughts become sharper. The fog begins to lift. The inner chatter, the endless noise of the modern mind begins to settle. Why? Because the energy that was once scattered, spilled carelessly into fleeting moments of gratification, is now being stored, cultivated, and directed. The mind, relieved of the burden of constantly chasing dopamine, begins to breathe. Most men are drowning in overstimulation. Screens, noise, distractions. Everywhere they turn, there is something pulling at their attention. And when they repeatedly give in to the lowest common denominator of their instincts, they reinforce a mental pattern of fragmentation. Each release becomes a signal to the brain. This is where pleasure lives. This is where you return when you are bored, sad, anxious, or lost. And so the cycle continues. The mind, no longer the master, becomes a servant to its cravings. But when a man begins to retain, that pattern breaks. He interrupts the signal. And suddenly, he has more attention to give, not just to the outside world, but to his inner world. He notices things. Patterns emerge. Ideas arrive that once felt out of reach. It's not that he becomes more intelligent, though he often feels that way. It's that his intelligence is no longer being siphoned off by an unconscious loop of depletion. There's a reason many high-performing athletes, artists, and spiritual leaders throughout history spoke of conserving this energy before important decisions or performances. They weren't obeying superstition, they were respecting something real. When you stop draining your nervous system through compulsive release, your brain begins to stabilize its neurochemical balance. Dopamine receptors reset. Motivation returns. Focus sharpens. You can sit in silence without itching to escape it. You can follow a single thought from beginning to end. You can actually think, not react, not grasp, but think. I once knew a young man who struggled with anxiety for most of his life. He tried therapy, medication, meditation, until he stumbled upon the practice of retention, not because someone preached it, but because he began to question the way his mind felt after each release. The fog, the crash, the spike and fall of emotion, it all began to feel unnatural, so he stopped. At first for a week, then a month, then longer. What he found surprised him. It wasn't just that his anxiety lessened. It was that he could think through the anxiety. Instead of being swallowed by the fear, he could watch it, analyze it, and make sense of it. He began writing. His creativity exploded. His conversations deepened. And most importantly, his relationship with himself changed. He no longer ran from discomfort. He could sit with it, observe it. And in that stillness, he discovered who he was underneath the noise. Retention, you see, is not about being rigid. It is not about denying pleasure. It is about transmuting raw instinct into focused will. And when the mind is no longer scattered by cravings, when it is no longer enslaved by the need to escape reality through momentary pleasure, it becomes a tool for precision. The man who retains becomes like a sword sharpened over fire, not because he is better than others, but because he is whole. His thoughts are no longer diluted by shame, nor dictated. They are rooted, disciplined, and clear. And this clarity extends far beyond the intellect. It touches intuition, the ability to know something without having to dissect it. The man who is retaining begins to hear that small voice within again, the voice that tells him which direction to go, which opportunity to accept, which relationship to walk away from. Most men silence that voice without realizing it. The constant stimulation, the endless cycle of release and regret drowns it out. But when the mind quiets, that voice returns, and with it comes wisdom. This is how the universe begins to reward the man who retains by giving him access to his own inner compass. He no longer needs to look outward for validation, for instruction, for confirmation. He becomes his own guide, and this inner authority radiates outward. In his work, he becomes more effective. In his relationships, more present. In his purpose, more precise. Because when a man thinks clearly, he acts clearly, and the world opens for the man who knows where he is going. Retention, then, is not a hack or a trend. It is an invitation to return to the self, to reclaim the clarity that is every man's birthright. And in that clarity, the man sees not only who he is, but who he was always meant to become. There is a certain kind of man who walks into a room and changes the atmosphere without speaking. People turn, not because of his looks or his voice, but because of something more primal, his presence. He doesn't need to assert himself. He doesn't demand attention. He is attention. And yet this quality cannot be faked. It cannot be taught in books or copied from influencers. It can only be cultivated from within. And one of the most powerful, most overlooked paths to this presence is retention. When a man retains his vital energy, his sexual essence, he stores within himself a current that once diffused his focus, scattered his power, and diluted his sense of self. This energy, when no longer poured out unconsciously, begins to accumulate. At first, it feels like pressure, a growing tension beneath the skin, a humming restlessness. But over time, as the man learns to channel this tension, it turns into something else, density. Not physical density, but energetic. He becomes heavy in the best way, grounded. His words carry weight. His silence feels full. People listen to him more carefully, even when he says little. Why? Because deep down, everyone can feel the difference between a man who has given himself away and a man who belongs wholly to himself. In ancient cultures, the masculine presence was associated with depth, stillness, and steadiness. A man was respected not just for what he could do, but for the atmosphere he carried. He was measured by how little he was moved by chaos, how rooted he remained in truth. This is the gift retention begins to offer, not because it changes your personality, but because it reclaims your original force. Most men today are bleeding out their life force in countless unseen ways. Every glance at a screen filled with hollow fantasies. Every scroll that triggers lust without intimacy. Every night spent numbing the soul for a few seconds of release, and each time they do, they give away a piece of themselves. A piece of their masculine magnetism. A piece of their gravitational pull, until one day they find themselves invisible, not because the world cannot see them, but because there is nothing left to feel. Now consider the opposite. A man who chooses to conserve, a man who does not give his essence away easily, who doesn't chase validation through sexual approval or pour himself into meaningless encounters. Instead, he channels it into his body, into his breath, into his purpose. He walks differently. His spine straightens. His jaw relaxes. His eyes carry stillness instead of searching. His energy radiates in a way that says, I do not need anything from you. I am already full. Women feel this, not in a romantic or sexual way alone, but in an intuitive way. They sense when a man is whole versus when a man is grasping. Children feel it. They become calmer around him, more grounded, because they are not picking up frantic leaky energy. Animals even respond. Dogs will sit beside him, not bark at him. Strangers will turn their heads. Clients will listen more intently. All of it begins subtly like ripples in a pond, but over time, the effects are undeniable. This magnetic presence is not ego. It is not dominance. It is not a man trying to be alpha. That too is performance. What they respond to is authenticity. Power that comes not from how loud you are, but from how still you are, from how much inner authority you carry. And that authority, more often than not, begins with your relationship to your own life force. You see, when a man retains, he is constantly telling his nervous system, I am in control. I choose where my energy goes. I do not need to chase release to feel powerful. I do not need the world to tell me who I am. And this self-containment builds an aura around him. Not a mystical glow, but a real energetic field that others can feel. We live in a culture where people are starved for presence. Conversations are shallow. Attention spans are fractured. Eye contact is rare. And in that famine of connection, a man who is fully present becomes invaluable. He becomes an anchor, a lighthouse. People find themselves opening up around him without knowing why. They feel safe, seen, and even healed in his presence. But none of this happens by accident. It happens through discipline, through consistency, through restraint. Not as suppression, but as sovereignty. The retained man learns to work with his fire, not be consumed by it. He doesn't avoid desire, he honors it. He integrates it. And by doing so, he becomes the rarest of men, the man who can sit with his own hunger and not be devoured by it. There is a story of a man in his late 30s who had always struggled with confidence, not because he lacked talent or intelligence, but because he never felt seen. Women overlooked him, employers undervalued him, even his family didn't seem to take him seriously. One day, after reading about the ancient practice of retention, he decided to try it. Not out of curiosity, but out of desperation. He had nothing to lose. At first it was uncomfortable. The urges were intense. He had to confront his inner shadows, loneliness, frustration, self-doubt, but he stayed with it. Slowly, things began to change. He started holding better conversations. His posture changed. He began making eye contact. People at work noticed something different. He wasn't louder, but he was clearer. Women began to respond to him not because he became more attractive, but because he became more himself. He didn't become someone new. He returned to who he had been all along. This is the ultimate reward of retention. Not just presence, but the restoration of essence. You do not become someone else. You become who you were before you gave yourself away, before you let the world drain your life force through mindless pleasure and emotional avoidance. You become a man others feel, even when you say nothing. And perhaps more importantly, you begin to feel yourself in the quiet moments, in your breath, in your bones. You begin to stand taller, not in arrogance, but in knowing. And the universe, responding to the man who has returned to himself, begins to open doors that were once invisible. There is a fire within every man that, if not mastered, will consume him. This fire is the very source of his vitality, his passion, his aggression, his drive. But without discipline, this same fire becomes chaotic, destructive, and impulsive. It turns into restlessness, addiction, anger, and escape. This is what many men face silently every day. The ache of being unable to govern their own instincts, the deep shame of knowing they are ruled by urges they cannot seem to control. And it is here, in the furnace of that fire, that the ancient practice of retention becomes a path not only of self-control, but of transformation. Retention forces a man to confront the storm within him. It demands that he sit with tension instead of numbing it, that he observe desire without collapsing into it. This is not about denying the body. This is about training the soul. And what begins to emerge from this uncomfortable, noble path is one of the greatest and most overlooked rewards a man can receive: emotional resilience. Modern life is full of triggers. Every scroll, every advertisement, Every social encounter throws something at the nervous system, and for most men, these triggers provoke a predictable response: reach for comfort, seek release, run from discomfort. But a man practicing retention begins to move differently. The very discipline of holding back, of saying no to impulse, begins to build something inside him, a rootedness. His nervous system stops flinching, his breath deepens, his reactions slow. He stops being a victim of emotion and begins to become its master. This is not about suppression. In fact, suppression is the enemy. The man who suppresses ends up exploding. True resilience is born from integration. When a man learns to feel his urges, to fully allow them, witness them, understand them, without being controlled by them, he steps into a new relationship with his own inner world. He no longer fears desire, he respects it. He no longer fights temptation with willpower alone. He transforms the very nature of temptation by seeing what lies underneath it. Because what lies beneath the urge to release is often pain, loneliness, anger, fear, and every time a man gives in without awareness, he bypasses the opportunity to meet those emotions. He avoids the very inner work that would make him whole. Retention, when done consciously, is an invitation to face those wounds head on, to sit with the emptiness instead of escaping it, to breathe through the fire instead of putting it out. I knew a man once. He was powerful on the outside, muscular, successful, articulate, but inside he was fragile. The slightest rejection would spiral him into despair. The smallest stressor would make him reach for distraction. He had no resilience because he had never stayed long enough with himself to develop it. But everything changed when he committed to retention, not as an ego challenge, but as a devotional act. He began to meditate, journal, sit in silence, and every time the urge arose, he asked himself, what am I really running from right now? What he discovered shocked him. Decades of unresolved grief, childhood wounds, a deep sense of inadequacy. He cried, he raged, he sat with it, and slowly, something began to harden, not in a brittle way, but in a refined, forged kind of way. He stopped needing people to approve of him. He stopped fearing the discomfort of conflict. He started facing life like a warrior, with presence, with openness, with unshakable strength. This is the essence of emotional resilience. Not the absence of emotion, but the capacity to carry it, to feel fully without being knocked off center. Retention helps build this strength, not because it avoids emotion, but because it creates space for it. When a man is no longer chasing the next release, he has the energy to actually feel his life, to process it, to metabolize it. His nervous system begins to trust him. His mind begins to calm. His body becomes a safe home, not a battlefield. And from this place, he becomes someone others can lean on. He doesn't lose his center when things fall apart. He can hold space for others without collapsing. In relationships, he becomes trustworthy, not just because he keeps his promises, but because he keeps himself. His woman can relax in his presence, knowing he is not being yanked around by every inner storm. His friends admire him. His enemies respect him because they know he is not moved easily. This emotional mastery has ripple effects far beyond the personal. In business, the resilient man handles pressure with clarity. In conflict, he remains calm and strategic. In chaos, he holds the vision. Life will test him. It must. But he no longer sees these tests as attacks. He sees them as initiations. Each moment of discomfort becomes an opportunity to anchor deeper into self, and the universe, ever responsive to frequency, begins to reward this kind of man, not because he is perfect, but because he is reliable. He can be trusted with more responsibility, more love, more influence, and he seems to steady with more and more power. It's so much fun to have you on. The doors that were once closed to him begin to open. Not because of luck, but because he has finally become someone who can walk through them with grace. Emotional resilience is the hidden gold of the masculine path. It's not glamorous, it's not loud, it's forged in silence, in the dark hours of wrestling with self. But when it's built, when a man can feel every urge and still choose his highest path, he becomes unstoppable. That is the reward. Not just peace, but power. Not just control, but freedom. There is a strange but undeniable truth that every man who walks the path of inner restraint eventually discovers. The longer he holds his energy, the more life begins to speak to him. Not through grand miracles or thunderous revelations, but through subtle signs, quiet nudges, perfectly timed moments, synchronicities too precise to ignore. Something deep within him starts aligning with something much greater than himself. His life no longer feels random. It begins to unfold with meaning, as if the universe had always been waiting for him to slow down, to wake up, to listen. The man who retains his essence starts to realize that he is not just a machine of instinct and flesh. He is a vessel, an antenna for something sacred. That which he once squandered carelessly now becomes sacred currency in a spiritual economy far older than any religion or philosophy. And as this current builds within him, it sharpens not only his body and mind, but his inner guidance. His intuition, once faint and clouded, begins to roar like a drum in the depths of his chest. Every man has this capacity, but most never feel it because their signal is too scattered. Their lives are a constant noise of distractions, cravings, addictions, and unconscious patterns. Their inner world is drowned in static. So the voice of the deeper self, the soul, the spirit, the quiet knowing, can barely get through. But when a man practices retention and does so not out of shame or ego, but out of reverence, something extraordinary begins to happen. His inner world quiets, and in the silence, the guidance comes. What begins as a faint intuition soon becomes a compass. He notices when something feels off. He senses danger before it strikes. He walks into situations with a strange knowing, guided by an inner current that he no longer questions. He learns to trust this feeling, and with each decision he makes from this place, life begins to respond, not always with comfort, but with confirmation. The right people start appearing, the right opportunities arrive, the detours that once derailed him now redirect him with precision. He begins to live in flow, not the kind of lazy, floaty spiritual bypass that avoids difficulty, but the real kind. The flow where action becomes effortless because it is aligned, where discipline doesn't feel like force but like devotion, where doors open not because he demands them to, but because his frequency now matches the room on the other side. One man I once guided told me of how, after just 2 months of serious retention practice, his entire sense of purpose began to shift. He had spent years grinding in a job he hated, pushing himself forward out of obligation, out of fear. But as he began holding his energy, he noticed something strange. His dreams changed. His body reacted differently to situations. His heart pulled him toward people and places he had once ignored. At first he resisted, but when he followed that quiet inner call, life rearranged itself. He found new work that not only aligned with his values, but ignited a creative fire he had long forgotten. It wasn't coincidence, it was consequence, the result of inner clarity meeting divine timing. And this isn't just a spiritual metaphor. It is observable reality. Neuroscience confirms that retention boosts dopamine baseline sensitivity, enhances neuroplasticity, and restores hormonal balance, all of which are key in regulating emotion, motivation, and vision. The fog of compulsive pleasure-seeking lifts, and with it, a man begins to see again, not just with his eyes, but with his soul. He sees what is no longer serving him. He sees the lies he has told himself. He sees the patterns he inherited but never questioned. And most importantly, he begins to see where he is meant to go, not in the form of a mapped out plan, but as a deep magnetic pull. The retained man doesn't wait for external signs to tell him who he is. He feels it in his bones, and that feeling is enough to move mountains. This is the ultimate reward the universe offers to the man who keeps his power within. Alignment, not with society's definition of success, but with the soul's purpose. And from this alignment, everything else flows. Relationships, abundance, contribution, because the universe does not reward noise, it rewards clarity. It does not respond to frantic striving, but to inner harmony. And a man who walks in harmony with his inner self becomes a force of nature. He no longer asks, "What should I do?" He listens for the deeper question, "Who must I become to carry what I have been given?" Because he understands now. His energy is not just for pleasure. It is not for scrolling or escaping. It is for building, for creating, for leading, for healing. And the more he retains, the more he has to offer. The modern world doesn't want men to find this power. It thrives on their distraction. It profits from their depletion. But those who rise above this game, those who reclaim their essence and choose to walk with their fire instead of fleeing from it, these are the men who change the world. Not with noise, but with presence. Not with force, but with truth. And life bends around a man who walks in truth. So the choice is always yours, to continue spilling your power in exchange for numbness and fleeting release, or to retain it, not just in the body, but in intention. And from that place of stillness and strength, to align with the deeper rhythm that is always waiting for you. Because the universe does not just watch, it listens. And when a man speaks through his actions, his restraint, his unwavering devotion to becoming more than his impulses, the universe does not ignore him.